Hi, welcome to my recording demonstration of my recipe application, Recipe Delights for POE Part 3 of programming. So over here is just the main code to call each, using an object to call each window that the user selects from the main option. Then in the create, over here is just to store the steps. Over here is to store the ingredients. So when they click the button for the save step, it will check that the steps are null and it would clear what was there before. So it would add the step and then it would display to the user that the steps have been saved. And if there's nothing, it will say, please enter the steps. Similarly for the ingredient, so basically it was also, so over here you instantiate the um, variable to the variable in the text that the user enters. So over here it's exactly the same. Over here it checks that the name isn't null, so if there's nothing entered for the name, then it would say please fill in all ingredient fields. But if they did it, it would, so when you press it, it would clear what was there, what the user entered, and then it would add everything to um, the recipe lists, and then it would indicate to the user that the ingredients have been saved. And then if they don't enter numeric values for ingredient calories and quantities, it will display to the user, please enter valid quantities and calorie values. And then similarly for the save button, it would make sure that the recipe name is not null. So making sure that there's no white space. So then it would, if the condition is true, it would add the recipe to the recipe list. Over here, if the calorie limit exceeds 300, it will display that to the user. So over here, and then it will just clear out the recipe name when they press the button. So over here as well, it'll indicate to the user that the recipe has been saved properly. And then if they haven't entered a name, it'll say, please enter the recipe name. And then for the add recipe, it was just to get from the user properties to get this and instantiate it so that we could create a recipe list for all the recipes that were saved. Then for next is display recipe. So for the display recipe, it checks that the indexes don't equal to zero. So it makes sure that there is recipes in the recipes in the to display. And if it doesn't, it'll give a power message saying that there was no recipes to display. Then there's a string builder that was used to amend the details of the recipe. So over here as well, there was a string builder used to create the recipe details so that it could display to the user. Over here, it was just the alphabetical order sorting. Over here was a for each that was used to display each recipe. And over here, we used the format recipe details. And over here was just used to display on the text block that it will just show hyphens throughout for each recipe to show to make it easier for the user to see what recipes they're looking at. Over here was just the code used to compare each string so that it would be sorted in alphabetical order. Then for the search recipe, there was a new a list created to store the recipes that would, so the recipe names. So there's a combo box that that populates with the recipe names as well as for food groups of everything that's stored in the arrays. So for instance, they decided to say that their food group was proteins, then in the combo box it would display proteins, or their recipe name was fruit salad. So it would display fruit salad on there, and they can choose. So recipe so the user can choose what they want to display. And then for food groups, it will display all food groups, all recipes with that food group name. Over here is the exact same implementation of the format recipe details using a string builder. And then over here, when they click to display the recipe, so it's just to check what item they selected. So this is the code implementation to check what option they pressed in the combo box. So they're ensuring, so it's just an error handling condition over here to ensure that if nothing was, to make sure that something was selected, and if nothing was selected, say please select a recipe name from the drop down menu. And if the condition is true, so they actually selected something, it would it also over here there's a for each saying recipe.recipe name equals selected item. So basically display this recipe that equals to the selected item. And then over here is the display option. Over here it'll say recipe not found just in case. So this is programming error handling just to see if the application was working properly. And then over here is what the users would see if to select. So it's a similar it's the exact same code almost for the food group selection. So over here it would store the recipes. So it's recipes in food group in a list, make sure it's not that item is selected. Um, over here, just make sure um, that the selected the recipe, so the list that stores the food groups contains the selected food group that they chose. Then they add the recipe, and then over here you display each recipe. If it wasn't found, then no recipes were found, or please select a food group from the drop-down menu if they never select anything. Over here for calories, it's also a very similar um, um, code implementation. So over here, I used the total calorie method. So that would be, so over here, it calculates total calories. So over here, it calculates the total calories that are for a recipe. So over here, it checks if the total calorie matches the max calories that the user chose, but it also displays recipes that are greater than that calorie value, so it displays more recipes. So for instance, if the total calories were 800 that they chose, and they have recipes that have maybe 850 calories and 900 calories, it will display those recipes as well. So it it provides more range option to allow for more easier use for the user. And then over here it'll just display all the recipes. And if they couldn't find the calorie limit, if you couldn't find a recipe underneath that calorie limit, it would say no recipes found to the user. But if they entered just to say a string, it would say it's not a valid input. So it would say enter a number. And lastly, it's the delete option, the delete window. So it checks if there's recipes to display, so recipe names to display. If there's nothing, it'll say, oops, no recipes to display to the user. So this sorts all the options in alphabetical order. This was a list box item, so they could select the certain recipe name that they wanted. So when they display to the user, it'll give a list of recipe names. They select the recipe they want to delete, and it'll also, so over here, it will also display the recipe next to it to ensure that the user selected the correct recipe. So it's just a more easier way for the user to see. And then over here, it checks that the selected item is in the list box. And then over here, it formats um, the selected option. So it shows the recipes, the recipe details, basically. Um, Over here is the actual code when they click the button for the delete the recipe. So it checks if the recipe selected, checks if the recipe is selected. And then there's just a flag over here to show in the system if it was found, then indicate it's true, else it's false. So there was no recipe found under their name. Over here is a for each loop to search for the recipe in the recipe list. And if it's found, then it's removed. So if it's recipe name dot equals the search, recipe search name, then it would remove it at that index. And then if it's not found, then it would remove it from the, so if it's found, then remove it from the list box. So the option isn't there to be displayed anymore. And it would say, it would display to the user the recipe that they deleted was successfully deleted. And if there's any errors that happen, it will say recipe was not found. And then in case there's any error exceptions, it would say error deleting the recipe in case there was any internal issues when deleting the recipe. And over here is the demonstration. So over here, the user has the option to create a new recipe, display, search, delete, or exit the application. So for create a new recipe, so they can enter a recipe name, just say fruit salad, then enter the ingredient name, so apples, they say a quantity of 2 cups, calories maybe 40, and then they have the option to choose between fruits, grains, proteins, dairy, sugar, sweets, or other, just in case there was any other options. And then also they get to choose from measurement type that they want, and they can save ingredients saved, and then they can re-enter more values. So just say they wanted to add grapes, so they can say grapes ingredient quantity maybe three cups. Um, Enter calories that could maybe, I don't know, about it's 120, but can just say that for instance. Then you can say save ingredient will indicate the user successfully saved. Then add grapes and apples to the bowl. Then they'll save a step, so they can re-enter as many steps as they want until they're satisfied with their recipe. Then they say add to recipe, it'll say it's successfully saved. However, if they exceed the calorie limit, it'll display first that they exceeded the calorie limit, it's just as a warning, and then it'll say recipe saved. And then you can say display recipe to display the recipes. So let's create another recipe quickly. Sugar bowl. Sugar, 1 cup of, which could be maybe 120. Sugar, sweeter sugars, save, add sugar to the bowl. So here it displays both the recipe details, and then for searching a recipe, it will allow the user to display either by recipe name, food group, or based on number of calories. So let me just, so it displays the recipe name. If I say food group, so sweeter sugars, it would display it as 120. It would display the sugar bowl recipe, and then and then it would display fruit salad, and then, so how much so if I type in 160, it should display the fruit salad recipe. So it displays 160. Yeah. So it displays the recipe. So yeah. Okay. And then you can search. Then you can also delete a recipe. So you can say sugar bowl. So it displays what recipes to ensure that the user knows the recipe they're deleting. Then you can say to the user it's been deleted. So then what's left is just the fruit salad. And then the user can exit the application. Thank you. This has been my demonstration.